Shortly after we began writing this book in 1992, I ran into Jerry in San Rafael. When I told him I was working on a book about my life with the dead, he paused for a moment, made a quizzical face, and shrugged. "Hell, just tell the truth, man, and don't be too hard on me." I'm sorry Jerry never got to read the finished book. It was in galleys at the time he died, because I thought of it as a long, affectionate letter to him in the same way Robert Hunter's lyrics were often personal messages to Garcia, saying in all those poignant songs the things he could never say to his face. The day Jerry died, deadheads danced in Haight-Ashbury. Wall Street closed early and people wept openly in the streets. Newscasters, comparing his death to that of Lennon and Elvis, said his passing marked the end of an era for which he had become the last great symbol. Jerry would have been bewildered at being made a symbol for anything. It was his fierce belief in the group spirit, the group mind even, that imbued the dead with their aura of collective ecstasy. It was typical of Jerry's generosity of spirit to make it seem as if the whole band possessed qualities that were really his alone. But in the end, he identified so absolutely with the Grateful Dead he ended up trapped inside it. However much he would have protested, Jerry was the heart and soul and magic of the Grateful Dead, and in the end that was too much of a burden for him to bear. It was already getting too much for him at the time I left the band in 1985. 10 years later, it killed him. Jerry was the Grateful Dead, not because he was the band's unofficial leader or its icon, but because of his noble spirit and stupefying resilience. However low we had sunk the night before, he would always come at the new day with an entirely unwarranted optimism. Jerry had a nature so endlessly curious he could, at a moment's notice, take off down any new road just to see what was at the end of it. His innate graciousness extended to practically anyone. So open and vulnerable was he that those who thought they were acting in his best interests began shielding him from new people and new experiences. It was a final irony that his boundless enthusiasms resulted in his being isolated from almost everyone. He hated the fame that had made him into a sacred monster. When I stopped using heroin 10 years ago, I assumed it was only a matter of time before Jerry quit. And when I saw those mysterious pictures of him scuba diving, surrounded by tropical fish, I thought, he's in his own element at last. He had solved Kesey's riddle by finding a way to inhabit his own hallucinations without drugs. This was the new Jerry, and all was well at last. But it was not to be. Jerry, it's true, did try a number of times to kick his habit. He died trying. I think for Jerry, drugs were a way of reconciling his contradictions. He was a nest of paradoxes, outgoing recluse, gullible hipster, ironic utopian, self-effacing star. His attempt to hold any number of irreconcilable ideas in his head at once was reflected in the way he played his guitar. His lightning fingering and chronic piling up of notes was an attempt to include everything. The flash of the spirit that unites was all that mattered to him. The moment-to-moment flow between the band and the audience, energy shifting through different forms in the twinkling of an eye. He was an oddity in the narcissistic world of rock and roll, a true beatnik who cared nothing for his image, a bashful lead singer, an introvert with such debilitating stage fright he was unable to eat anything before going on stage. Considering the dancing day of the dead skeletons and skulls that inevitably pursued the Grateful Dead, it's odd that Jerry was so superstitious about death. He would never say the word or allow himself to be photographed in front of a tombstone, and was always pained when promoters came up with graveyard scenes to advertise the band. When Pigpen died, Jerry and I went to his funeral together. Lying in an open casket, in his blue jean jacket, covered with his pins and buttons, Pig looked a lot better than he had in some time. But Jerry was appalled. "Don't ever let this happen to me," he said as we walked away from the coffin. "There are just two things I want you to promise me. Don't ever find me in the back of a record store signing records, and don't bury me in an open casket. Whatever paradise he's transported to, I hope it includes sunfish and coral reefs, and that in that liquid alchemy, All the paradoxical elements in his nature transformed themselves into something rich and strange. And Jerry, if you're listening, save me a gram of that cloud.